This video is now in session, and this shouldn't really take long, but because it shouldn't be that complex. But Republicans are not all Republicans are extremists, and not all Democrats are socialists. I think that's a pretty simple argument, or pretty simple assertion. Yet these days, a lot of politicians paint Democrats and Republicans in very, very radical terms. We see individuals like Nikki Haley and Kimberly Guilfoyle, also Donald Trump, paint Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as socialists. Meanwhile, you see a lot of Democrats, progressive Democrats, painting Republicans as extremists of conservatism, right-wing extremists who are not in touch with democracy. And both of those statements are kind of wrong. Just using the definition of both is kind of disproves those arguments. When it comes to socialism, that means that the government controls everything, every part of life, and businesses have no say. And that's not what Democrats are. For the most part, there are a few Democrats who are socialists, but Joe Biden still is very much for businesses. So is Kamala Harris. For example, he let businesses ultimately decide whether their employers should be vaccinated or not. Joe Biden also has a lot of business people in his administration who are much in favor of capitalism, like BlackRock executives, who kind of lobby for capitalist measures. So there's no reason to think that Joe Biden is a socialist. But it's pretty much been always a thing of Republicans painting Democrats as socialists or communist individuals, a communist party. Just because those kinds of terms invoke fear among people, especially because of the Cold War. But this may eventually fade, though. The thing with painting Democrats as socialists is that these days socialist doesn't have as strong of a term, as strong of a connotation, negative connotation as it did before, because we're seeing a younger age group transitioning into power and government, into a bigger political voice, and those individuals have not experienced the Cold War, so they don't really have any of those kinds of socialist, anti-socialist, anti-communist time periods. And the other thing is that for the most part, Republicans have kind of started to juice most of the socialist rhetoric that they can. Eventually, the socialist fear, I guess, will fade away unless if a new war starts, probably with China. But that's a totally different thing. Nonetheless, as of this moment, though, Democrats are nowhere near a socialist party, like Venezuela or Cuba. And if we look at the socialist politicians in Congress, if one of them is Bernie Sanders, and Bernie Sanders is very popular with a lot of people, especially those who support Donald Trump, because we've seen how populism has been able to get past the fears of socialism and to get the support of a lot of Americans. Meanwhile, right-wing extremism, a lot of Democrats call moderate Republicans extremists, which obviously doesn't fit in with their ideology. The thing with right-wing extremists is it's less about as of this current moment, it's been less about actual policies and more about culture, about right-wing culture, and a return to more traditional, supposedly traditional family values and patriotic values, almost more towards nationalism rather than patriotism. And the thing with that is that even though a lot of Republicans are complicit in that kind of movement of the Republican Party towards that direction, that still does not quite mean that every moderate Republican is a right-wing extremist. Take Young Kim, for example. She's not a right-wing extremist, even though people like to call her so. And the thing with calling people on the other side as extremists or socialists, communists, far righters, is that it degrades them and it doesn't do anything to help with the situation. If you just call the other side a far right person, is that going to change their mind? Is that going to make them come more towards your position? No. Is that going to convince people to switch to your side? Not necessarily, unless obviously if you're an immigrant. For immigrants, it's a lot easier to manipulate immigrants because a lot of them come from socialist countries. The way I sounded made it sound malicious, so I'm sorry about that. But I mean, it is true. But nevertheless, the thing is, it doesn't really add to the conversation that much. It doesn't really add to the reasons why why someone should vote for you, why a constituent should not vote for your opponent. It does sometimes work. Obviously, in Florida, it did work, but in most other places, it didn't really work. It's in terms of calling Democrats socialism and socialists, and in terms of calling the Republican Party as a whole as extremists, that also didn't work because we saw in the 2020 election that Republicans made gains in the House. They made gains in local elections, even though Democrats called Republicans as an entirety as right-wing extremists. So with that, we see how this kind of rhetoric is both damaging to public perception of the other side, and it also doesn't do anything to help the situation. It doesn't advance any cause. It doesn't help your cause, and it doesn't really do much at all. So when it comes to calling the other side as extremists, we'd recommend to avoid that kind of language. You can call it so, but and you can be like those Twitter users, political Twitter users who just vent their frustrations at the other party. But in the end, it's not going to do much for yourself or for the other side. So make them try to reason with them. And even though a lot of times this nation has gotten so polarized that it's getting harder to reason out with the other side, it's still not impossible, and it will never be impossible. So that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.